So this video is going to go through how we can use some different tips and tricks to add numbers together in our head. So we have three different tips or tricks that we can use to do some of that mental math and hopefully avoid some calculation mistakes despite not being able to use a calculator. So first, we have addition of larger numbers and specifically solving tips that might help us do that. So adding larger numbers is based on the same principles that we use with smaller numbers, but it's just a little bit harder sometimes mentally than adding smaller numbers. So it is often prone to more mistakes when you're trying to do it in your head, especially if you aren't able to use a calculator. So there are some tips that can help you with avoiding those mistakes. One of those tips, use the commutative property. So remember, we've talked about commutative property as being able to switch the order of numbers and still get the same result when you're adding throughout an expression. So for example, 8 plus 993, we can really think of that as 993 plus 8 because it's typically easier to add a smaller number in our head to a larger number as opposed to the other way around. Another tip would be to break down the addition into looking at each of the place values, the ones, the tens, the hundreds, etc. So you can use the long addition process, but if you want to solve these in your head, then you can also think of it as adding in place value piece by piece. So for example, we can see right here, 1875 plus 923. I'm adding 923. 923 is really 900 plus 20 plus 3. So 9 is in the 100 spot, 2 is in the 10 spot, and then 3 is in the 1 spot. So 3, 20, and 900. Again, if we put those together, we do get 923, but it can be helpful to split it up like that because then we actually are going to start by adding the ones place digit. And we are allowed to do that. We are allowed to change the order of the 900, the 20, and the 3 because of the commutative property. So that a commutative property allows us to reorder the operations in any way that you see fit. So 900 plus 20 plus 3, we can reorder that. And we want to add the ones place first, and then we move to the left from there. So then we add the tens, then we add the hundreds. If there were thousands, we would keep going, so on and so on. So here we take the 1875 and we add 3 to it. And when we do that, we get 1878. But then what we will do is we will add that 20 in. So we're going to take that 20 and we're going to add that 20 to the 1878 and we'll get 1898. Then from there, we add in that 900. When we do 1898 plus 900, we get 2798. So that's a way that we can break down either in your head or on paper and end up with our result from the original, but kind of piecing it together using the place values. Another option is to add a higher round number and subtract the difference. So for example, here we see add 512 plus 449. So sometimes it's easier, especially when we're pretty close to a round number like 450. 449 is really close to 450. So if I think about taking 512, and if you want to think of it in physical items, sometimes that's helpful to put an actual context to it. So maybe 512 pencils, and I'm adding 449. Instead of doing that, I can think, okay, if I add 450, I just added an extra 1, but it's a little easier to work with because it ends in a 0. We have a 5 there, like a 50 at the end of the number. And it's sometimes easier to add to that 512. And so then if I add 512 and 450 together, I have to remember in the end, well, I added an extra number, whatever that may have been, whether it was a 1 or if I had some extra beyond that, if it would have been 445, I would have had to remember that I added an extra 5. So whatever that may be, we have to remember to subtract that out in the end. So I started with 512, I add 450, but really I only wanted to add 449. So I subtract that one extra one at the end. So 512 plus 450 gives me this 962. But again, to really compensate for adding that extra one, when I added 450, I have to subtract that one away in the end, and that's how I get 961. So for some people that works. Again, these are just tips and tricks that may help you, and they may be something that isn't as helpful for you. It just depends on the person. So 7,658 plus 2,563. Let's look at this and use some of those tips up above. On this one, I'm going to go ahead and look at this 2,563 as 2,000 plus 500 plus 60 plus 3. So I'm going to break it down into its place value digits. And so really we're adding 7,658 plus, and I'm going to put the ones first. I always suggest to start with the ones. That way, when you're adding and you're combining those values, you're not having to carry, which we'll see in the long addition process next, but you're not having to carry values in your head. So when we start with the ones place, that helps to avoid that. As we continue, we won't have to continuously carry because of where we started. So 7,658 plus 3 plus 60 plus 500 plus 2,000. So adding that 2563 in parts and pieces. So if I start here, this 7,658 plus 3 is 7,661. And then I'm going to add 60 to that. So 7,661 plus 60 gives me 7,721. And then I can go ahead and add in my 500. When I do 7,721 plus 500, I get 8,221. But I still have to add in my 2,000 that I have not added yet. And when I combine those together, I end up with 10,221. So that would be my final answer on this one. So adding in part by part can be a helpful way to do this mentally. On the second example, I'm going to talk you through a different trick there. So 2784, we are actually going to go ahead and add 1,000. Now, I'm thinking of 1,000 because 986 is pretty close to 1,000. If you think about 986, for example, on a number line, 986 is here. We'll say 1,000 is here. This is 14 off of 1,000. So if I'm adding 1,000, I'm adding an extra 14 up front. So I'm going to need to subtract 14 in the end to account for that. And if you think about 1,000 minus 14, if you work backwards 14 from 1,000, you'll get to 986. So it's really like 1,000 minus 14 is 986, but I am going to go ahead and actually add the 2784 in the 1,000 first. And when I do that, I get 3,784, but then I have to subtract 14 so that I can account for the extra 14 I added in when I added 1,000. So when I subtract those, it's really like, because it's just two digits, it's really like leaving the 3,700, and just subtracting the 14 from the 84. So 84 minus 14 gives us 70. So 3,770 is our final answer on this one. So hopefully that helps a little bit with some tips and tricks on how you can use different methods to do some addition in your head.